This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional world. Reaching those goals often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging jargon-free communication that boils down complex topics to capture the attention of decision makers and general audiences. Interested in getting a free resource to help you do just that? Go to complexitymadeclear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down, but not dumb down, complicated science and technical topics for key stakeholders. I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Olivia Bullock to the show today. Olivia is Assistant Professor of Communication and Director of Undergraduate Communication Program at the George Washington University. Dr. Bullock's research focuses on how message design can reduce barriers to information processing and how effective information processing evoked through message design can facilitate persuasion. She explores these ideas in risk, health, and science communication contexts. In addition to her research, Olivia is also a communication practitioner with previous experience working in public relations and advertising for agencies in Washington, D.C., and as a consultant on the Department of Health and Human Services We Can Do This COVID-19 vaccine campaign. Olivia earned her Ph.D. and MA at The Ohio University and her BA at American University.
All right. Well, it's so great to have you here on the show, Olivia. And I want to ask you about your career journey to your current role as professor at George Washington University, because it also includes work in public relations. Now, you've been in academia for a while, obviously getting your PhD and now teaching. If you could take listeners on the road with you and how this whole pathway developed.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to share a little bit more about my research and my professional experiences. As a professional, I initially started my career, as you mentioned, in public relations. So some of the first companies that I worked for were public relations and strategic communication agencies. The first that I worked for was doing PR and strategic communication work specifically for Silicon Valley tech startups. So working a lot with companies who were emerging and new and needed to not only get attention as they were developing, but also sometimes navigate difficult regulatory landscapes. So for example, one of the companies that I initially worked for had done some of the strategic communication work for companies like Uber, when Uber was not widely accepted in lots of different metropolitan areas or states. And to me, that was fascinating work because so much of it was communication, interfacing with the public around potentially controversial or new technology areas. And often the goals of those campaigns were to win over public opinion so that the public would put pressure on their legislators to change the regulations or rules in a particular area. And so I really enjoyed that work because much of it was about how do we communicate about sort of these complex technology issues or science issues or even health issues with a public that might be skeptical or afraid or feel like they're risky. And so I really enjoyed that work. I then worked in a different agency that worked on behalf of clients in the federal government, Department of Defense, intelligence agencies, and the government contractors that served them. And I did that because I thought, okay, I'm really liking this regulatory stuff and this sort of public policy stuff. Why don't I try doing some more public policy work? Turns out I really liked tech and I really liked health. And so I knew I wanted to go back for my PhD. I thought I would do it later in life. But as I was going through my career, I was sitting in rooms with amazing leaders and executives thinking about campaigns that would shape public opinion and result in the things that we wanted them to. But I was not in the room with anybody who was thinking about the evidence behind the campaign strategy or thinking about how do we base a campaign in something that we know will be effective. It was very creative in nature, but maybe not as scientific. And so I've always found myself wondering, there must be somebody who's asking these questions and approaching it from a science perspective. There must be a way that we can be more confident that the things that we're putting out into the world will achieve the results that we want them to. And before that time, I didn't even know that communication research was an option. Did not know you could get a PhD in communication, but I did some digging around and guided by some mentors, ended up going to get my PhD in communication at Ohio State. At Ohio State, where I graduated from with my PhD, and in my current work as an assistant professor at George Washington University, my research continues to ask those same questions of how do we talk to the public about topics that might feel risky or uncertain to them, particularly with science, technology, and health. How do we break those topics down in a way that feels approachable and accessible to public audiences? And I will say that although I've now been doing this research for 5 or 6 years, I have not gotten rid of my love for the practical. So I have remained involved as a practitioner outside of my PhD. I've done some work for technology companies. I'm currently doing some work for some digital health technology companies. And more recently in the pandemic, I also was a consultant on the CDC's COVID-19 vaccine campaign. So I like to keep one foot in each world and try to maybe balance research and practice.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. So you've got tech, you've got government, public health, and now academia, of course, like the backing, the actual evidence. I'm really curious about the work you did before you got your PhD and any learnings that stood out as you were dealing in these very high stakes situations, learnings that you took from your work, both in government and in tech, and then how you're testing some of these things on your PhD.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So one of my first very formative work experiences when I first started out in PR and I was working for the agency that worked for technology companies is that often with the types of companies that we're working with, there would be crises. So when you're interfacing so closely with the public and in these sort of high stakes environments where there's a lot of news coverage involved, there's a lot of fundraising involved, there's a lot of people involved with a lot of feelings involved, there would be crises that would emerge. And so I really got a fascinating kind of hands-on experience navigating these different crises, trying to stay on top of the narrative, figure out exactly what would resonate with the public at a given time, how we could ease people's fear and uncertainty, and then how we could ultimately pivot and come out stronger on the other side. And I'd say that because as much as you never want a crisis to happen, I used to love it because it was so fun and dynamic in an ever shifting, ever changing, and challenging environment. And so in my current research, one of the areas of work that I focus on is about disasters because disasters are, of course, a huge science issue where the scope of natural disasters is increasing in their geography and in their intensity as the climate warms. And we have this situation where people are beginning to politicize disasters and are maybe not getting information that they need to make the best decisions for themselves and their loved ones. And that's because sometimes science information is complex. We're also dealing with a lot of uncertainty with disasters. There's lots of information that people are getting access to. Sometimes people have information overload. There's the emotion involved. There's the fear. A disaster to me is like that crisis environment where there's so many barriers for us to be able to communicate with people. But if we can get a message just right, it's possible for us to see actionable difference in how people respond in those crisis moments. And so I think it's funny that you asked that because there's definitely experiences that I have and continue to have as a working professional that really inform how I think about my research, just maybe on a bit more of a global scale rather than for an individual company.
Yes, for sure. I want to pinpoint one particular piece of work that is just amazing relating to narrative, right? So narratives and data. This is an area that I've been really interested in for a while. And your research, which I'd like you to talk about in a moment, really to me is very insightful and instructive when you are in a very high stakes emotional type of environment or that there are decisions that need to be made and you've got all this data and information. And then the question is how to present it. And that can be in a disaster zone for sure, when you've got information about where to go and what to do and what the forecasts are and all that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, you're dealing with humans who are afraid, for example. And so I'd like if you talk a little bit more in depth about that research and your thoughts about what went into it and background for listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So my research is motivated by a central theme, which is if I were going to give advice to practitioners, communication practitioners, evidence-based advice, what kind of advice could I give them? And so that's the common thread in my work. And that sort of motivated the study in particular that you're talking about stories. There's a large movement in strategic communication to share stories with people. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of evidence that suggests that we process stories differently than we process other types of information. Some scholars point to the fact that in our very early days as humans, we had to share information with each other through stories. And knowing a story and being able to share a story could be the difference between life and death if you were trying to share information in those very early days. And there's a lot of evidence that the way that we process story information is different than the ways that we process fact-based information. And particularly when you're in a high stakes environment where the audience that you're trying to communicate with doesn't have a ton of analytical, what we call central processing power, meaning being able to really effortfully think about things and really mull them over carefully, it can be important to understand ways to communicate more heuristically, meaning people can get the message and be persuaded by it without needing that sort of in-depth analytical style of processing. And so stories are that opportunity. And so in the work that you're talking about, what I did was identify that so when people actually report feelings of ease when they read stories relative to reading non-stories, and that the feelings of ease that they experience tend to make them respond more persuasively to the message content. So people are randomly assigned to hear a story or a non-story about a person who overdosed on caffeine. It was a sort of a health, or kind of a random health topic, but I used caffeine consumption because it affects different types of people in different ways. It's not necessarily a gender or an age specific ailment. And so people listened to either the story or the non-story version. And people also had different levels of white noise laid over the audio message. So if you have white noise that you've ever heard, like on a machine, when we have white noise, if you ever imagine being on a train or in a public place and there's background noise going on, it can be hard to listen to what you're trying to listen to. And that sort of interferes with our information process. And some people did not have the white noise or interfering with information processing condition. And basically what the finding was is that the people who got the story, again, they responded more positively to it. They felt good about the story and they reported all kinds of persuasive outcomes, like thinking that the story was effective, feeling more efficacious, that they could avoid these health issues, feeling more interested in health, feeling more of like a health person, versus people who did not get the story had the opposite effects. They disengaged from the message, they didn't find it interesting, they felt like it wouldn't affect them, and they were not susceptible to the issue. And so what this tells us is that stories, again, can be a really effective medium for sharing information with people, especially, again, when that information processing is obscured, like I mentioned with the white noise element to it. Even when people had more difficult information processing with the noise induction, they still liked the story better and the story still performed the best. And so this is, I think, a good message to communicators that if you need to share information with people in a way that's persuasive, for people to process, can be more sure that you're going to get the outcomes that you want to see. Stories can be a really effective tool for doing that.
Yes, and it's really interesting too because sometimes I consider like metaphors or similes like micro stories, and it's almost like you are telling. It's almost like a snippet of something that's so relatable, has some of the same qualities maybe that a full blown story might have. I want to ask you about something you mentioned about the you have the experience, of course, in academia, your PhD, your current work. At the same time, you have your pre-PhD work in industry, and you're currently consulting as well. Are there times when you are in one venue, say you're in your consulting role, and you're talking to practitioners, and they're suggesting things about messaging and so forth, where you're like, as the academic, you're thinking, this is not going to work, or the evidence does not support this. It's like the complete opposite of probably what's going to happen. And then conversely, when you're talking with your colleagues, university and other places, where they may be suggesting things because the literature says X and Y, and you're like, well, actually, I've been involved in situations like that in the private sector in the real world, and it doesn't usually play out like the theory suggested it might.
Yes, exactly, for both of those things. So, for example, when I work often with health and technology companies, a big thing that they love to use is jargon. Often, health and technology companies think that using the bigger words makes them look like more of an expert or produces more credibility or makes them seem more persuasive. And a significant body of my work finds that, especially when communicating with lay audiences, you really want to lay off the jargon. Jargon tends to make people feel like this message is not for me. I don't like it. I don't like this topic. I don't like this company. This feels unsafe. This feels risky. count me out. And so, especially if you're a company that's trying to communicate with audiences who may not be as familiar with the terms you're using, using jargon can be extremely detrimental. And so I always really push back when I'm working with clients who want to include jargon in their work for that reason. Another example would be I was working adjacently with a client on some sort of creative ad campaign that they were working on. And they were a health device technology company. And they really wanted to showcase the device in all of their communication. They wanted everybody to see pictures of the device. What we know is that about human attention is that our eyes are drawn to faces. We don't, all of our attention really goes to faces. If there's anything else, we don't look at that, we look in face. And so if we're talking about like banner ads or Facebook ads or digital ads, you're not going to really get people's attention unless there's a face that's going to draw their attention to it. So again, another example of often as practitioners, they have immediate goals and they think, oh, this makes so much sense. I want people to see the device. I'm going to show the device. No, you want people to look at your ad. And so you need to put like a face on it.
Yeah.
So a perfect example there. And then, yeah, I think the reverse is true as well. Certainly when I've been preparing studies or working with other academics, I think the practical hat that I'm able to bring can really be, I hope, an asset. For example, I did a study related to how the language used in ballot measures can affect people's vote choice. Finding there was that the more difficult language people saw in a ballot measure, these were real ballot measures collected from all 50 states, the more difficult language and unfamiliar language, so words like eminent domain or the things that we don't hear that often, the more of those that appeared, the more likely people were to vote against the ballot measure. And so obviously this is like a really cool practical finding. The academics I worked with were all about, we should really share this with legislators and whatever. And I had to be like, we don't know how this information could be used. You know, if somebody really wants something to not pass, for example, putting kind of these ideas out there and advocating publicly for this scholarship could have unintended consequences. And so while I do love to talk about that study, and I think it's a really important and significant finding, just another example again of how having a foot in both worlds, I find to be the best because I'm able to think abstractly and creatively in my research, but also really think about the real world implication in practice.
Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful. I want to ask you about leadership because you also have in your professional profile experience working with leaders, being a leader, particularly at the Fisher Leadership Initiative. And one question that I've been had over the years at times is, are scientists leaders or should they just follow the data, for example? And this idea that I'm not going to advocate, I know that can be tricky for a particular course of action. I'm just going to present the information. We saw with COVID, sort of the blending of boundaries of science, public health officials encouraging certain behaviors because it was backed by the evidence and responses to that and so forth. So I'd love for you to talk about your experience with as part of that and also your thoughts about leadership and how academics should or shouldn't be involved in leadership activities, say outside of the academy.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that's certainly an individual decision. I know lots of academics, for example, who think it is not their place to publicly related to their research findings. And then, of course, I know academics who love and see huge value in that. So I think it's definitely a personal decision. For me, because my work is motivated by having a practical impact, I could not have that practical impact without being able to talk to real people and communicate the findings to real people. And for me, it's also just from my perspective, my ethos is often our research is funded by real people. So they should be able to know exactly what people are finding and be able to have these findings translated to them in a way that feels accessible. Another significant motivator of my research is information equity. So making sure that everybody has the same access to information that they need to make the best decisions for themselves and their loved ones. And so for me, I think that means that I would not maybe add in any political level for one approach or another. And that's tricky because as science and health get more politicized, it could be really hard to kind of tread that line. But certainly, I am never afraid to advocate for all of the things that I found through my research about how to make information feel easier for people to process, feel more accessible to them, feel more engaging, particularly again around health and science topics where people have like their health and well-being at stake. And so I think that many academics might not be as comfortable with leadership, but especially when it's subjects that sort of make a real world impact, I think for me, it's a moral obligation.
Thank you. Thank you. So much of this is such high impact. And as we're talking right now, we're in the first half of November of 2022. I often hear people talk about during the pandemic as if it's over. Other people are continuing to take health protocols that will help prevent the spread of infection. You mentioned consulting that you're doing in the same area. And I'm wondering, as we wrap up, if you could share your thoughts about just a number of things regarding COVID, whether it's how precautions and protocols were messaged earlier on and are now, or things like COVID fatigue or countermeasure fatigue to the extent that people are following the measures, and also how to deal with this prevailing attitude. It seems that the pandemic is over, even though right now, as we're speaking, we're heading into the winter when more people are inside and the virus is still circulating, or variants of it are, that can very much make people sick.
Yeah, I think that's a really salient point. And I'll start with was done well. And I have really nice exposure to this because this is part of the work that I did with the Department of Health and Human Services. The messaging that particularly Health and Human Services, which encompasses the CDC, was working on was really community driven and community oriented, even if it didn't seem that way or that became diluted in sort of its mass production. So different groups within HHS were charged with reaching out particularly to underrepresented populations or populations where there might be vaccine hesitancy or skepticism due to historic mistreatment by federal government entities. So, for example, Black and African American communities, Hispanic, Latino communities, Asian American communities, and American Indian, Alaska Native communities. So, reaching out to those communities, doing focus groups with members of those communities, identifying community sort of leaders who were comfortable learning about the vaccine and becoming the ambassador to their community about it, sharing the message with others, making sure that those voices were heard and represented in the creative material and in the messaging, I think was a really, really valuable thing that was done. And I think ultimately the vaccine uptake in those communities has actually in many states exceeded uptake by sort of white majority communities. So I think that those efforts were huge, and being really community oriented and inclusive, I think was a really valuable thing that was done. I think when people are talking about COVID and what went wrong, we're often thinking about some of the more public facing. I'm thinking about press conferences or question Q&As or interviews. And something that I advised, whether it's my practical clients or would advise anyone with crisis, what we know about crisis research is that it's incredibly important to not only tell people what you know, but also tell them what you don't know and be very transparent about what is unknown. And so I think because if you don't tell people what's unknown, we have a lot of fear and uncertainty. And where misinformation and sort of conspiracy theories thrive is giving people answers to those unknowns. So if you leave those unknowns open or in a vacuum or you don't acknowledge them, that's where people pour in alternative ideas and alternative theories that can spread really quickly because we want the closure. We want to know the why. We want to know what's going on. And if that uncertainty isn't acknowledged, people will look for certainty in other places. And so I think, especially from public health agencies, it's so important, again, to not only say what's known, but also say what's unknown and acknowledge that, be able to say, like, I'll be honest, we're not sure about this, but we're working on it. We're hoping to get answers to this. Here's what it might be. But leaving it open and only saying what's known and not necessarily being as forthcoming about the uncertainty, I think can be a real problem. And I think that's maybe where some of the initial conspiracy theories or misinformation related to the origin of the pandemic or fears about the vaccine sort of came in. And so I think that nobody prepares you for communicating during a crisis like that. I like to say that I hope it's a once in a lifetime experience for me, but I do think that we have certainly learned so much from it. And it was definitely learning not only from a science perspective, a health perspective, but from a communication perspective. I think the communication has continued to improve over time. And I think there's lots and lots of lessons that will be learned by communication scholars and practitioners because of what worked and what didn't work during the pandemic.
Dr. Olivia Bullock, this was a great conversation with so much insight and different perspectives too that you don't often hear from academics. And you've got tremendous experience on a whole variety of areas. Thank you for what you're doing. You're focusing on some of the biggest, I hate to say existential issues, but I think, I don't think it's overstating when you're talking about things like climate change or COVID. So thank you for doing what you're doing, making this accessible and explaining it in a way that can have broad resonance and people can hopefully take protective action when it's necessary.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's the goal. And I appreciate so much for always being given an opportunity to get more public access to this work. So I appreciate you reaching out and I'm really happy to have been here.
And thank you, listeners, for being along on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.